For most of human history, people believed they bought things because they needed them. They believed that food to eat, clothes to wear, and tools to work were rational purchases limited by necessity. But at some point, that logic broke. People began buying things not for what they did, but for what they said. Once that shift happened, spending stopped being about survival and started being about status. This wasn't a modern invention driven by social media or advertising algorithms. Long before Instagram, an economist noticed that much of economic behavior had nothing to do with utility at all. It had to do with being seen, signaling rank, and proving, quietly or loudly, that you belonged above others. Consumption isn't just economic behavior, it is social performance. And once you see that, you start to understand why so many people work harder, spend more, and feel poorer than they should. To understand why this happens, you have to look at the world Thorstein Veblen was observing in the late 19th century. It was a period of explosive transformation where industrialization rewired the economy at a pace no society had ever experienced. Railroads stitched continents together, and industries like steel, oil, and finance minted fortunes almost overnight. A small class of industrialists accumulated staggering wealth, while millions of workers crowded into factories, living lives that were precarious and tightly constrained. This was the Gilded Age. It was called gilded, not golden, because while it gleamed on the surface, inequality widened beneath it. Crucially, that inequality wasn't hidden, it was displayed. The wealthy didn't just possess money, they performed it. Mansions rose in cities, servants multiplied, and leisure became an elaborate, visible signal. Wealth announced itself theatrically through expensive clothing, extravagant dinners, and unproductive hobbies. What made this era different was how deliberately wealth was shown. Wait, it gets worse. As the middle class watched from below, they were surrounded by images of elite life that began to redefine what success looked like. Comfort was no longer enough. Respectability required imitation. The distance between classes became something people tried to bridge not by earning more alone, but by spending more visibly. This was the environment Thorstein Veblen stepped into. Veblen was the son of Norwegian immigrants, raised in a frugal household that valued work over display and restraint over indulgence. He was socially awkward, skeptical of authority, and unimpressed with wealth for its own sake. He spent his life as an outsider, observing elite institutions without ever fully belonging to them. That outsider position gave him the advantage to see what classical economists missed. While they assumed people were rational actors seeking to maximize utility, Veblen saw people paying more for goods precisely because they were expensive. He saw impractical clothing that served no function yet signaled refinement. He saw homes designed to impress guests rather than provide comfort. Here is where the mechanism becomes truly dangerous. Veblen realized that consumption wasn't aimed at satisfying needs, but at communicating that you didn't need to work with your hands. In a society where productivity created wealth, the highest signal of success became visible non-productivity. Doing nothing expensively was proof you had already won. He called this conspicuous consumption, spending whose primary purpose was visibility. The object itself mattered less than the audience watching you acquire it. A coat didn't just keep you warm. A watch didn't just tell time. They were social signals disguised as products, used to announce status and distance from necessity. People weren't being foolish. They were responding rationally to social incentives. If wealth is invisible, it doesn't work for you. So wealth had to be loud. But it wasn't just about what they bought. Veblen noticed it was also about how they used their time, which he called conspicuous leisure. The ability to avoid productive labor became a signal in itself. Leisure stopped being rest and became a performance. Traveling, attending events, and cultivating hobbies that produced nothing tangible. These weren't escapes from work, they were proof that work was optional. This inverted the logic of value. In a productive economy, efficiency should be rewarded, but socially, inefficiency became prestigious. The more waste you could afford, the higher your position appeared. A fragile object requiring constant care was more impressive than a durable one because it signaled you had the resources to waste on maintenance. Clothing that restricted movement signaled refinement precisely because it made physical labor impossible. Once this system takes hold, the elite set the standards of taste for everyone else. What began as elite display became middle-class aspiration. The middle class didn't have the same resources, but they were surrounded by the signals, so they stretched. They borrowed, they sacrificed stability for appearance, and they worked to avoid appearing left behind. In a society where success is visual, invisibility feels like failure. Veblen understood that this process was endless. There is no point at which status competition resolves, because someone always has more. Consumption becomes a treadmill disguised as progress. The more productive an economy becomes, the more intense this pressure grows. Rising incomes don't eliminate status anxiety, they simply raise the price of entry. What once signaled success becomes the baseline, requiring new, more expensive signals to emerge. This leads to a diagnosis of extreme fragility. An economy driven by conspicuous consumption doesn't allocate resources efficiently, it allocates them visibly. Capital flows towards status goods rather than long-term resilience. People invest in appearances instead of security. Because the rewards are social rather than financial, the costs remain invisible until they accumulate into crushing debt and secondary savings. Risk hides behind lifestyle. Because everyone is watching everyone else, opting out feels dangerous. You don't just risk being poor, you risk being judged. In certain markets, higher prices don't reduce demand, they create it. When a product's value lies in what it signals, price becomes the product itself. Lowering the price doesn't make the good more attractive, it destroys its purpose by removing the barrier to entry. Modern marketing didn't invent this logic, but it refined it to a science. Luxury brands don't explain why their products are better because explanation suggests justification, and justification suggests insecurity. Instead, they rely on scarcity and silence. The suggestion is that if you understand, you belong, and if you don't, you weren't meant to. This is Veblen's economy in action: price as a signal, and markets that reward distinction over efficiency. Social media has now industrialized this behavior. Visibility is no longer occasional, it is constant. Consumption is no longer private, it is curated, documented, and monetized. Platforms reward display, and algorithms amplify lifestyles that look successful, not necessarily ones that are stable. Even restraint, minimalism, or wellness can become a form of conspicuous consumption once it is performed publicly. The financial consequences are inescapable. Lifestyle inflation quietly tracks income growth, and household debt rises alongside prosperity. People earn more and feel poorer, not because their material conditions worsen, but because the reference point keeps moving. The comparison never stops. Modern financial systems don't just enable this consumption, they depend on it. Credit smooths the gap between desire and means. Brands sell belonging rather than utility. The economy grows, but so does fragility, because growth fueled by status anxiety is brittle. It requires constant novelty and constant reassurance that you're keeping up. The system needs people to feel perpetually behind to function. Veblen's warning wasn't that comfort was immoral, but that when societies confuse display with value, they train people to chase signals instead of substance. When that happens, financial freedom becomes harder to recognize and even harder to achieve. Real wealth doesn't need an audience. It doesn't announce itself. It buys time, optionality, and resilience. But those things don't photograph well, and they don't trend. They don't impress strangers, so they are undervalued in a system obsessed with visibility. Veblen exposed this contradiction to reveal the game. Once you see conspicuous consumption for what it is, a social technology rather than a personal failure, you gain perspective. You can decide when to participate and when not to. History doesn't repeat, but the incentives do. If you don't understand the incentives shaping your behavior, they will quietly shape your future. Would you like me to expand on how modern stealth